Let's talk AMD X870 motherboards. I've previously reviewed this Gigabyte X870E Aorus Elite Wi-Fi 7 at a cost of £290 including VAT here in the UK, and I liked it quite a lot. I've also reviewed this MSI MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi, and that costs a slightly more scary £430 here in the UK, but I liked it a very great deal. Superb motherboard. And that begs the question, what am I going to make of this Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero, which sells for £590 here in the UK? That's a huge price. Does it mean it's a step too far for Leo? Or will I like it even more than these cheaper motherboards? Our first question, what sort of accessories do you get in a motherboard that costs you £590 including VAT? Well, we have a kind of quick start guide inside the box itself. That's useful. The motherboard, which weighs a lot. Some paperwork. More paperwork, bits and pieces. The motherboard. A kind of note about Wi-Fi, which in fairness does vary from territory to territory, so depending on which frequency and what power, you get this Wi-Fi or that Wi-Fi. Okay, that's legit. Some stickers. A quick start guide, which is only a couple of pages long because it's multi-language. However, the chart with the connectors and the color coding and the key. So, for example, let's take note number 6 in green. And there we go, there's note number 6 in green, power connectors. It's a quick start guide, appears to fulfill its function. Something, oh, a bottle opener. Okay then. What? Oh, a ROG kind of credit card sort of thing, presumably for signing into some user account. However, you have a QR code so you can look at stuff. If you're getting the impression I'm underwhelmed, you're about right. Flash drive with drivers. Useful. We've seen that for a while now. I like it. SATA cables, there, that is an RGB extension, that's a Wi-Fi 7 antennae. This is one of those handy little adapters, so you plug in the front panel connections from your case to this, and then you plug this into the actual motherboard. And then this lot is all to do with SSDs, as explained in the quick start guide. For example, if you're using single-sided SSDs, you obviously have a thinner SSD, it doesn't have chips on both sides, so you need to put a rubber on the one side to hold it up against the heatsink. One of the features of this motherboard is easy PC DIY. In other words, it makes it easier to build your PC quickly. We've seen this with other makes of motherboard, quick installation of M.2s, both in terms of the SSD going into the motherboard and then the heatsink going back in place. The irony is, in order to make that work correctly, you need a load of extra bits. The motherboard itself looks the absolute business. So let's take a tour of the ROG Crosshair X870E Hero. The aesthetic is clearly very dark in colour, mainly black but not quite. When the board's connected, we have RGB in this panel here over the rear I/O. That looks very good, as you'll see later. Heatsinks on the VRM's very large, and we have a tall heatsink on the primary M.2. Turning to the rear, we have a backplate which has the Hero branding, and obviously that's also intended to help thermals. The rear I/O panel, loads of USB, dual Ethernet, Wi-Fi 7 antennae, and it has plenty of USB-Cs. Onboard micro buttons, we have the main power connector, an additional power connector, dual 8 pins for EPS. There's no power connector down at the foot of the board, but the extra power to the board is handled by that connector there. and we have headers and connectors all around the periphery. Let's pull off some heatsink so we can take a closer look. Removing the main M.2 heatsink, nice and straightforward. Removing the other M.2 heatsink, slightly less straightforward. Now I don't much like that. The thing is, when you have a graphics card in place, that's not going to go well. This heatsink under here is accessed by screws that are behind the back plate, and that covers the chipsets. X870E is dual chipset. And now we can see more clearly that we have 5 M.2s in total. We have 2 PCI Express x16 slots, which are Gen 5. When we remove the rest of the heat sinks, we can see the VRM setup is an 18 plus 2 by 110 amp using Vichy smart stages, and there are 2 further stages that Asus tells us are rated at 80 amps, although the spec of the hardware suggests they're more like 50 amps. VRM controller is an Asus DigiPlus ASP2205. Memory support is 4 DIMMs of dual channel DDR5 8200 or faster if you overclock. Maximum capacity 192 gigabytes. The dual expansion slots 2 times PCI Express Gen 5 by 16. However, depending on the configuration, the primary slots times 16, or they're both times 8, or we got times 8 times 4 times 4. And the explanation there is we have 5 M.2 slots, 3 are Gen 5 from the CPU, 2 are Gen 4 from the chipset. However, if you populate the 3 Gen 5s from the CPU, they start using bandwidth from the second PCI Express slot. In other words, if you want to use all your M.2s, you can use the main PCI Express slot, and it's best to forget about this slot here. We have 4 SATA 6 gigabit per second connectors, which is absolutely fine, and we also have this slim SAS, and Asus does not include a cable in the box. It feels like the days of them including U.2 on motherboards. Never used one of those in my life. I doubt I'll ever use slim SAS. I'm not sure what the cost would be of including that, but it seems completely unnecessary. Turning to the rear I/O panel, look at all those ports and connectors. I doubt you're going to use them all, but haven't you just got a fine selection? We have 2 USB 4s rated at 40 gigabits per second and 2 USB Type-Cs rated at 10 gigabits per second. There are internal headers for 2 USB Type-Cs rated at 20 gigabits per second, one of which can deliver up to 60 watts of power. On the rear we have 6 USB A's rated at 10 gigabits per second and internal headers for 4 USB Type-A's rated at 5 gigabits per second, along with headers for 4 USB 2s. The Ethernet is a Realtek 5 gigabit per second and an Intel 2.5 gigabit per second. I think we can all agree it'd be better to have a single 10 gigabit per second. Wi-Fi 7 is provided by MediaTek, as is the Bluetooth 5.4. The 7.1 channel audio is Realtek ALC 4082, and we have an ES9219 DAC. The graphics output, I doubt many of us are going to want to use that. That's HDMI 2.1. Overall, I'd say the hardware looks very promising. And the obvious next question is, what does the BIOS look like? To get our PC running, the processor is an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X 3D, and that is a deep cool thermal paste guard. Just keeps everything neat and tidy. The memory is 32 gigabytes of G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo DDR5 6000, has an Expo profile. SSD is a Crucial T700, which is PCI Express Gen 5. Let's just snap the heatsink on that. Power supply is a brand new Seasonic Focus GX1000. Obviously it's in white, and it's ATX 3.1, the very latest standard. And our graphics card is an MSI RTX 4090 Ventus 3X 24 gigabyte. Let's just show you how you install and remove the graphics card in this motherboard. So it clips into place like that. And you'll notice there's no release button as we've seen on other motherboards, and the heatsink on the M.2 is really close to the graphics card. How can you remove your graphics card? The answer, surprisingly, is you just pull it. You don't have to release anything. The catch at the end is spring loaded. There's no release mechanism. Our CPU cooler is a Fantex Glacier 1360 D30. That means it has 30mm thick fans, works really effectively. But before we install the cooler, let's just install some thermal paste. I'm going to use some Arctic MX4, tried and true. And before I lock down the cooler, let's just remember to plug in the graphics card. And we're just about ready to get the PC running. We head into the BIOS and we find a huge number of typical ROG features. You can tune literally any part of your new PC. There are dozens, possibly hundreds of options, and some of them refer to AI. This applies to both overclocking and also to fan control. We're not going to change any of those settings. We're going to leave them all on auto, with the exception of Expo for memory. We want that running at the correct speed. And of course, you'll probably want to set fan curves for your cooling system, although you can leave everything on auto quite happily. After that, we go into Windows and we install the Asus Armoury Crate software. This takes a while and sadly involves logging into a newly created account, and then we can look around. Unsurprisingly, despite the initial promise, there isn't a great deal to see. We can play with RGB control for the lighting on the rear I/O shield. By default, this is a white pattern with the letters ROG, and it looks pretty good in RGB as well. The other point of interest within Armoury Crate is to check that drivers and software are up to date. The live update feature works perfectly well, and our PC is now ready for action. You might wonder why I left all those BIOS options on auto. And there's a simple explanation. To my mind, manually overclocking AMD processors is a fool's game. Yes, you can tweak them very slightly, however, auto works really well, and if you want to get busy with them, the best way in my experience is to use PBO in the BIOS, Performance Boost Overdrive, or dive into Ryzen Master and start using Curve Optimizer. Those methods work really well. Changing specific settings on voltages and such like in the BIOS, I suggest you give that a miss. However, just to double check my homework, when I reviewed this Ryzen 7 9800X 3D using the MSI X870E carbon Wi-Fi motherboard, I both overclocked the processor and also ran it on auto. And in addition to running the processor and this hardware on the current version of Windows 11 24H2 on this Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero, I have also used all this hardware on this MSI Mag X870 Tomahawk Wi-Fi. Review coming very shortly, so I won't get any further into the motherboard features. However, the Tomahawk features in the charts for this Asus. So we have three sets of figures for the Ryzen 7 9800X 3D running on auto, and one set of figures for that processor overclocked. And that should make it crystal clear whether or not you should be overclocking your AMD processor.
As a world-leading manufacturer, Cyberpunk PC UK expertly builds each PC with the largest range of parts available in the UK. We handle all your packages with care and ship them directly to you on next day delivery. Visit cyberpowersystem.co.uk.
In Geekbench 6 multi-core, we can see 4 blue bars. The top of these is the overclocked Ryzen 7 running on the carbon Wi-Fi, drawing 110 watts. A very short distance behind that we have the Ryzen 7 running on the Asus ROG Crosshair on auto and drawing 126 watts. Just behind that we have the Mag Tomahawk with the processor running on auto, drawing 114 watts. And the lowest score of these four, but you'll notice all the four scores are very close together, is the processor running on auto, drawing 120 watts on the MPG X870E carbon Wi-Fi. In other words, there is some separation between these four scores, but not a lot of separation, and it's clear that the Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero is running the processor relatively hard on quite a lot of power on auto. Moving on to Geekbench 6 single core, we can see the four blue bars separate somewhat, however the scores are very similar. At the top of the 4 and close to the top of the chart, we have the overclocked CPU on the MPG X870E Carbon. A few places below that, we have the same motherboard with the processor running on auto. Behind that, we have the Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero, and just behind that, but only 2 points behind, we have the MAG X870 Tomahawk. Running on auto, there is almost no difference between these three motherboards. And it's a similar story with Cinebench R23 multicore. The Carbon Wi-Fi with a processor overclocked scores just over 24,000 points. Behind that, we have the MAG X870 Tomahawk with the processor on auto scoring about 23,500. And 100 points behind that, we have the Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero running on auto. A tiny distance behind that, but essentially in a tie, we have the MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi running on auto. Once again, while the scores on auto are very similar, the power draws for the processors on auto are quite different depending on the motherboard. And we can see this when we drill into power consumption in a 10-minute run in Cinebench R23. This is the power draw for the CPU package rather than the system as a whole. We can see the MSI MAG X870 Tomahawk requires 110 watts, the Carbon Wi-Fi 120, the Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero requires 126, and in this particular test, when you overclock the processor in the MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi, it requires 141 watts. In the next test's 3D Mark CPU profile, we can see all 4 blue bars very close together. On auto, the Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero has the beating by a small head of both the Carbon Wi-Fi and also the X870 Tomahawk. 3D Mark Time Spy combines both processor and graphics. Way up the top of the chart we see Intel's 14th gen processors, further down we see the 4 blue bars, and the top of these is the MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi overclocked, but it's a mere 1 point ahead of the Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero, which in turn is a tiny amount ahead of the MSI MAG X870 Tomahawk, and then the MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi running on auto. And we move on to gaming. Far Cry 6 on Ultra preset at 1080p. Right at the top of the chart we have the MPG X870E Carbon overclocked, and very close behind that we have the same motherboard running on auto. A single frame behind that we have the Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero running on auto, and then a handful of frames further back we have the MAG X870 Tomahawk. You can see the range of those 4 scores on the average is 14 FPS and the 1% low range is 20 FPS, and that is significant. The next game is Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, again on Ultra preset and running at 1080p. Top of the chart we have the Asus ROG Crosshair X870 Hero running on auto. Just behind that we have the MAG X870 Tomahawk also running on auto. A short distance behind that we have the MSI MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi on auto. Then we see the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. Fifth in the chart we have the X870E Carbon Wi-Fi overclocked. A curious result, but it doesn't take away the fact that the Crosshair X870E Hero wins out in this game. And we move on to Assassin's Creed Mirage on ultra high preset, again on 1080p. And again at the top of the chart, this time by a single FPS, we have the ROG Crosshair X870E Hero, followed by the MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi on auto, and that beats out very slightly the Carbon Wi-Fi overclocked. In this instance, the overclock processor suffers when it comes to average, but wins when it comes to 1% low. So a bit of give and take. Just behind that, we have the MAG X870 Tomahawk. Our fourth game is Cyberpunk 2077 on Ultra preset at 1080p. At the top of the chart by a few FPS, we have the Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero. Behind that, we have the MAG X870 Tomahawk. And then we have the Carbon Wi-Fi overclocked and the Carbon Wi-Fi on auto. It's a clear win for the ROG Crosshair X870E Hero. It's interesting to note the Tomahawk in second place does well on average, however the 1% lows look actually slightly poor. Our final game is Total War Pharaoh on Ultra preset at 1080p. Top of the chart is the MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi overclocked. A few FPS behind that, we have the Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero on auto. And then you have to step back another 5 or 6 FPS to the Carbon Wi-Fi on auto, followed by the Tomahawk on auto. And so we come to my conclusion about this Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero, the pros and cons. The plus points: we have a huge number of USB ports, including plenty of the fast Type-Cs. We have an impressive VRM, and the cooling system on the VRMs is also very good. You get 8 PWM fan connectors, and that should power any case and pretty much any cooling configuration, particularly if you use fan splitters. And finally, I quite like the RGB panel that sits over the I/O shield. Cons, the negative points. The biggest of these by a huge margin is the price, which is just sky high. Secondly, populating all of the M.2s eats into the available PCI Express bandwidth. That second expansion slot, in my opinion, pretty much becomes useless. Thirdly, when you're installing M.2s, the bottom heatsink covers 4 of them, so you pretty much want to install your M.2s before your graphics card. Now, I've demonstrated removing the graphics card is quite easy, so if it's air cooled you shouldn't have a difficulty, but if you're liquid cooling, that could get nasty. And finally, and this might be a small complaint, including a slim SAS connector on this type of motherboard seems like a very strange move. That doesn't sound like a desktop feature in the slightest. Overall, I can't really recommend this motherboard. I'm going for a worth considering and a 7 out of 10, and that's entirely down to price. The motherboard itself is superb, but I do not want to pay this much money for an X870 desktop motherboard.